I'm Dr. Julie Anné, coming to you from A New Beginning and the Healthy Way Out in beautiful Scottsdale, Arizona. Welcome to my third episode of Not Your Typical Eating Disorder Recovery Tips Tuesday. In this part one of this part two episode entitled Feel or Food, I'm going to help you identify what are the common barriers that stop you from connecting to your emotions so that you ultimately can support yourself through them and resolve them, and you no longer need to turn to food because you don't have any other skills. Now, as a licensed psychologist practicing for 26 years, I have always believed that we have to go beyond mere development of skills and or mere kind of knowing what the behaviors are that you need to do to change your unhealthy behaviors. My gosh, you already know what those behaviors are, and if you were able to do it, you would have already done it. My approach with both my clients and the approach that I want to take on this educational video is to look at this in kind of a three-pronged manner. First of all, we want to look at kind of what has occurred developmentally, or what are your emotional deficiencies that stop you from being able to do the behavioral change that you want to do. We want to then understand what I call what is the bridge from those emotional deficiencies to then your maladaptive use of food, i.e. your eating disorder behaviors. And then finally, now that you are a wonderful adult and you can now take control of your life and your emotional self, we're going to work on redoing those early deficiencies so that you can actually have success in manifesting the behavioral change that you would like. Okay, so let's start by first of all talking about what I see as the four primary obstacles that I have found really are a hindrance to my clients being able to connect up with and then therefore be able to support themselves through their feeling process. The first barrier to being able to connect up to your emotions is a history where somewhere in your early development your feelings were either not acknowledged or they were not responded to. Now, I'm always quick to say that this is inadvertently, in most cases, done. Okay, parents try to love their children. Caregivers are always, or most always, well-intended. But unfortunately, sometimes things can go awry in life. So there are some circumstances that I have seen oftentimes do lead to the early experience of your emotions not getting responded to, which then you internalize and then tend to repeat within yourself, which we're going to talk about in part two. Okay. The first is if your parents were either physically or emotionally unavailable or not present. Okay, and this can happen because maybe your parents had to work several jobs, you came home from school, you were a latchkey kid, parents got home late, and there were a lot of times when you went through your day and your feelings were just not paid attention to, and at some point you learned to just detach from them. Other times, maybe a parent or a caregiver is depressed or they have struggles with alcohol and they just are not tuned into or are not capable of responding to your emotional cues or your emotional self. Okay. Other times, maybe a caretaker is deficient within their own process and they're just ill-equipped with their own emotions so that they are just not able to pay attention. And sometimes there's a circumstance where there's just too many kids and just not enough emotional space for everybody to be attuned to and therefore then connected to. So the end result of this circumstance is that you had feelings when you were younger. We all do. but somehow they were on a consistent basis, not acknowledged or not responded to. And this pattern over time then became internalized, and that was your own process within yourself. So then you turned into either a teenager or a young adult or maybe an older adult, and you actually are disconnected from your emotional experience, at least on a conscious basis. Okay? We know that we're still connected on an unconscious basis, and that is oftentimes why we might be feeling something like sadness or loneliness or frustration. It's operating under the surface, but we're not connected on a conscious basis. Therefore, it's disruptive inside. We do get emotionally triggered, and then we find ourselves engaging in some sort of eating behavior, either compulsive overeating or binging and purging, or sometimes numbing out through restricting. So the first obstacle that I often see that leads to people being detached from their emotions is an early, consistent experience, this is over years, where your feelings were not responded to or not acknowledged, and then you learned to become detached yourself. The second situation that I often see as an eating disorder specialist that causes people to be disconnected from their emotional process and then to reach out to food in order to maneuver yourself through your emotional world is if your feelings, again, in your early life were responded to in a negative way. And I see 4 primary ways. One would be if those feelings were invalidated. So this is where you would be connected to your emotions. You expressed some difficult conflict or something that bothered you when you were younger, but then it was met with some statements that were invalidating. Okay, you shouldn't feel that way. What's wrong with you? Okay, I don't think you should have anything to worry about. Okay, what you're saying doesn't make sense to me. Okay, so you have an experience, you express that experience, but somebody that was a primary person in your life invalidates it. And that leads to then you beginning to question yourself, was this even a valid feeling? Okay, very disruptive. The second is if those feelings that you had when you were younger were actually minimized by others. Okay, so again, when you were connected and you expressed this outwardly, usually to a caregiver or a parent, and those feelings were minimized. Okay, that's nothing to cry about. That's nothing to worry about. You should hear what I dealt with in my day. Okay, or I don't know what you're crying about. That's no big deal. Okay, so you had this very real feelings of experiences of feelings. You expressed it outward, which is a healthy thing, but it was met with minimalization. And therefore, as an adult, when you experience an emotion, guess what? You minimize it yourself and you don't pay attention to it. It still operates under the surface and then usually triggers and leads to an eating disorder behavior. Okay, but it never gets resolved because guess what? It was minimized and therefore you don't pay attention to it. The third situation that I oftentimes will see in my clinical experience that can lead to a disruption in how you experience your feelings is when there was a situation where when you were connected to those emotions, it was so big or so painful or so traumatic that if you stayed connected, you would actually be overwhelmed. You would feel so frightened that maybe you would become shattered, okay? That if you connected and stayed connected to those emotions, you would just literally emotionally fall apart, fragment, cease to exist, okay? Many, many times when there are big feelings and we are small and we are ill-equipped, it gets experienced in a really big way that floods us. And if you don't have a caretaker that is there and responsive and helps see you through those emotions, your psyche is going to take over, and it's going to do actually what's a really kind of cool survival mechanism, and that's that you're going to disconnect, and in extreme cases you're going to dissociate from that feeling at all. Okay, when this happens, especially repeatedly as a child, you grow up into an adult and you are still disconnected from those emotions, even though maybe those emotions might not be that overwhelming, or even though that experience that was so traumatic or disturbing is no longer occurring. Your psyche doesn't know that, and it still protects you by disconnecting from those emotions. The problem there, though, is that emotions are still occurring. They happen every day. You're feeling those emotions, but you're not able to respond to those emotions. They get disruptive underneath your emotional surface, and then you find yourself engaging in eating disorder behavior to respond to those emotions on an unconscious level. Okay. The last scenario that I see that ends up disrupting our ability to have an emotional feeling process that is healthy is, again, in your early development, when you were connected to those emotions and you did allow yourself to feel that there was not a primary caregiver that then came in and comforted and or supported you during that emotional process. Okay, that would be in the form of, come here, let me hold you, it's okay to cry, I'm here, it's not going to hurt you. Okay, followed by let's talk about this, and then ultimately let's support yourself through whatever bad happened. Okay, when we don't have those experiences growing up and we become adults, we feel these emotions, but we have no emotional equipment to be able to support ourselves through this feeling process. Again, we're still having that feeling experience. There's a lot of activation going on for you emotionally. And then unconsciously, especially if you are wired with other contributing risk factors for an eating disorder, you're going to gravitate towards food to try to manage and comfort those emotions because you don't have any other skills or any other experience that occurred early on in your emotional infrastructure to help you see yourself through those feelings in an emotional, healthy, and comforting manner. So let's review. People have difficulty with their feelings and with their emotional process. I think that that is true of all of us as human beings. And certainly if there were certain sets of unfortunate factors for you growing up, you might be ill-equipped to deal with your emotional process. If you have other risk factors that then lead you to reach for food as a way to cope with your emotional process, it then is going to lead to eating disorder behavior. The 4 primary obstacles that I see to a healthy feeling experience is, number 1, the feeling of not having your feelings acknowledged or responded to in a healthy way during your formative years. Number 2, having your feelings invalidated or minimized or judged and criticized, okay, when you were young. Thirdly is if there were experiences and feelings that just were so overwhelming and so painful, in the worst case scenario during, let's say, an experience of trauma or abuse. And lastly, if you had big emotions, traumas, or issues, and there was not anybody there that actually appropriately comforted you through those emotions, no one that created that safe space, responded to you, comforted you so that you learned that you could support yourself through those emotions and actually come out the other side. So this is a review of what typically happens that stops us from being able to be connected in a healthy way that allows us not to turn to things like food. And in part 2 of Feel or Food, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about then what do you do to correct this situation now that you are an adult and you are empowered and you are in control of your emotional life. I am Dr. Julie T. Anné. I hope that you have enjoyed this 3rd episode of Not Your Typical Eating Disorder Recovery Tips Tuesday. This is part 1 of Feel or Food. If you enjoyed this episode, please do like it. You can always subscribe to our YouTube channel and certainly tune in for part 2, which should be in a week or 2. You can also find me on From Hunger to Fulfillment with my partner in change, the wonderful Dr. Ashley Southard, who also has a series called Way Out Wednesday for our clients on the other end of the emotional spectrum or the behavioral spectrum, and that is our emotional and or binge eaters primarily. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really look forward to next time. You take care, work hard, believe in recovery, and support yourself through it. Take care.